There are certain humiliations in life that, if merely spoken of, people would think you made them up. But for me, it happened in broad daylight, right in the middle of a corporation with thousands of employees. On that day, I was forced to my knees on the cold granite floor of the main lobby for 3 agonizing hours by my own mother-in-law, a powerful, tyrannical CEO under the stunned gaze of hundreds of strangers. Not because I had stolen anything, not because I had broken any company rules, but simply because she wanted to show me who was the master and who was the servant. She laughed loudly, her voice echoing with sadistic pleasure, as if she were savoring every single minute I bowed my head in disgrace. But what she didn't know was this. Right at the moment my knees touched that freezing stone, a phone call was made, a command was triggered, and exactly 30 minutes later, the woman standing at the absolute pinnacle of power would plummet straight to the bottom in a way no one could have ever anticipated. This story is not just about a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It is a story about karma, about the limits of human endurance, and about the exact moment when the woman deemed the weakest suddenly holds the power of life and death over the one who humiliated her. And it all began with that one time I was forced to my knees. That morning, the sky over Chicago was a murky gray, as if something heavy was pressing down on the human soul. I stood in front of the corporate skyscraper, looking up at the gleaming glass windows reflecting the pale sunlight, and a sudden, indescribable chill washed over me. This was the place I had worked for the past 2 years. The place I walked into every day with the small, fragile hope that if I just worked a little harder, endured a little more, things would eventually be okay. But I never expected that in this very building, I would have to swallow the greatest humiliation of my life. The corporate lobby was packed that morning. The sharp click-clack of designer heels echoed against the marble floor, the rhythmic beeping of security badges at the turnstiles, the lively chatter of employees greeting one another. Everyone was rushing, consumed by their tasks, their projects, their quotas. As for me, wearing a slightly faded blouse and clutching a stack of files to my chest, I walked much slower than usual. Not because I was tired, but because I knew today would not be a peaceful day. I had barely taken a few steps when a familiar voice rang out behind me, as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "Stop right there." I turned around. Standing before me was my mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance. She stood with her back perfectly straight, arms crossed. Her expensive, tailored suit hugged her frame perfectly. Her makeup was flawless, and her eyes looked at me as if I were nothing but a piece of trash in her way. "I am heading up to my department, ma'am," I asked softly, trying to maintain my usual polite demeanor. She smirked, a smile utterly devoid of warmth. "With that attitude, do you really think you deserve to stand in my company?" Before I could even process what was happening, she turned to the people standing nearby, intentionally raising her voice so everyone could hear. A daughter-in-law who doesn't know her place needs to be taught from scratch. My heart hammered against my ribs. The eyes of the surrounding crowd began to dart toward me. Some pretended to look away, others stopped entirely, whispering, "What is the CEO saying to her?" I was trembling. She took a step closer to me, the overpowering scent of her expensive perfume hitting my face, suffocating me. "Kneel." Just one word. Terse. Freezing cold, leaving me absolutely no way out. I froze, paralyzed. "But this is the company," I stammered. "Exactly because this is the company, I am teaching you a lesson." Without waiting for me to react, she signaled to the private security guards standing nearby. 2 burly men stepped forward. They avoided my eyes, looking deeply uncomfortable, but they followed her orders. "Keep her right here. 3 hours, not a single minute less." I was forced to my knees in the middle of the grand lobby. The moment my knees hit the freezing marble, a sharp pain shot straight up my spine. I bit my lip hard, fighting back a cry of pain. All around me, the whispers began to spread like a tidal wave. "Oh my God, is that the CEO's daughter-in-law? Why is she making her kneel like that? I heard she's incredibly disrespectful at home." Every whisper was like an invisible needle piercing my ears. I bowed my head low, my hands gripping the hem of my shirt so tightly my knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I did not want to show any weakness. especially not to the woman standing before me with that victorious, gloating look on her face. She crossed her arms, looking down at me, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Remember this feeling, so that from now on, you know exactly who holds the power in this family. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. The sharp, decisive clicking of her heels echoed in her wake, leaving me kneeling, isolated and exposed, in the middle of a bustling corporate lobby. Time passed with agonizing cruelty. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. My knees began to go numb. My back ached, and cold sweat beaded at the nape of my neck. But in that exact moment, amidst the humiliation and physical pain, a strange, profound calmness washed over me. I raised my head, watching my mother-in-law's back disappear into the private executive elevator, and in my mind, only one thought echoed: keep laughing. These 3 hours will be the final price you ever make me pay. I quietly slipped my hand into my pocket and touched my phone. The screen was dark, but I knew that it only needed to light up once for everything to violently reverse course. Time dragged on so slowly, I could hear every beat of my own heart echoing in my chest. The lobby was brightly lit, the central AC humming steadily, yet sweat continued to pour down my neck. The sharp, freezing pain in my knees had transitioned into a dull, agonizing ache, as if hundreds of needles were piercing my skin simultaneously. More and more people walked past me. Some practically sprinted, keeping their heads down, pretending not to see. Some slowed their pace, glancing at me before whispering to their colleagues. There were even stares of naked, unapologetic curiosity, hiding a sick fascination with seeing someone else humiliated. I caught fragments of their gossip. That's the CEO's daughter-in-law. I heard she married into money from a trailer park. Guess she's getting put in her place. Every word was a slap to my dignity. I gritted my teeth, digging my nails so deeply into my palms that they drew blood. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream that I had done absolutely nothing wrong, that I was a human being, that I had self-respect, but I knew that if I stood up right now, I would lose everything. I recalled my first day stepping into the Vance family estate. On my wedding day, my mother-in-law looked me up and down, her eyes as cold as a pawn shop broker appraising a cheap trinket. She asked me where I went to college, what my parents did for a living, and how many acres of farmland we owned in Ohio. When she heard my parents were just ordinary blue-collar workers, she let out a soft, "ah," and then ignored me for the rest of the dinner. From that day on, I understood my place in her eyes. I was not allowed to speak much. I was not allowed to argue. I was not allowed to be sad. And I certainly was not allowed to hold my head high. The sound of high heels stopped right in front of me, snapping me back to reality. I looked up. It was my mother-in-law's executive assistant. She bent down, pretending to look sympathetic, but her eyes betrayed her utter disdain. "Just endure it, Claire. She's just blowing off some steam. Once you're done kneeling, it'll be over." I looked at her, letting out a bitter, silent laugh in my mind. To them, my humiliation was just a passing piece of entertainment. My back was growing stiff, my neck rigid. I shifted my weight ever so slightly, but even the smallest movement sent a wave of pain so intense I almost passed out. But right at that moment, I felt a gaze that was completely different from the rest. In the corner of the lobby, an older, distinguished man had been standing in silence for a while. He didn't laugh. He didn't whisper. He just quietly observed me. When our eyes met, he frowned slightly, as if trying to recall something incredibly important. My heart gave a slight jolt. Did he know who I was? I immediately lowered my head, making sure not to reveal anything else. I couldn't afford any mistakes right now. I had to let everything play out exactly as it was supposed to. I had to let them believe that I was just a weak, pathetic daughter-in-law, a powerless employee trembling on her knees in the lobby because the CEO wanted to make an example out of her. The phone in my pocket vibrated lightly, just once, very softly. I didn't look at it, but I knew who it was. The only contact set to that specific vibration pattern, the only person who understood that if I didn't answer immediately, it meant the plan was a go. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my breathing steady. The pain in my knees had reached a point where I could barely feel my legs, but internally, I was terrifyingly calm. It was the calm before a massive hurricane, when the surface of the ocean is unnaturally still. From afar, I heard my mother-in-law's voice echoing from the mezzanine level, dripping with triumph. Let her kneel until she learns her place. In this company, my word is absolute law. I pressed my lips together. Law? In just a few moments, someone is going to teach you what real law looks like. These 3 hours of kneeling were just the opening act. When the large analog clock on the lobby wall struck exactly 9 a.m., I had been kneeling for nearly 40 minutes. That number might not seem long to a bystander, but to someone enduring every agonizing second, it felt like a lifetime. The morning rush hour had ended. The employees were all at their desks. Only a few people trickled through the lobby, but the emptiness only made me feel more exposed, like a stain deliberately left out for everyone to see in this pristine, luxurious space. I heard the ding of the elevator opening on the ground floor. A group of impeccably dressed executives walked out, looking rushed. Among them was a tall, silver-haired man with a deeply serious face. As soon as he saw me kneeling in the center of the lobby, he stopped in his tracks, just for a second. But I clearly saw the shock flash across his eyes. He turned to the man next to him and asked quietly, "What is going on here?" The other man leaned in and whispered, "The CEO's daughter-in-law is being punished." The older man said nothing more, but his pace slowed. His gaze lingered on me much longer than necessary. I kept my head down to avoid eye contact, but a strange feeling rose in my chest. The people who understood how power really worked were beginning to sense that something was deeply wrong. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was a sustained buzz. I knew I couldn't delay any longer. I leaned forward slightly, pretending to shift due to the pain, using my hair to shield my movements as I quickly brought my phone to my ear. "I'm here," I whispered. On the other end of the line, a man's deep, decisive voice spoke. "Has the confirmation been verified?" "Yes." "She is in the building." A brief pause. "Are you absolutely sure, Claire?" His voice dropped, becoming grave. "If we trigger this clause, there is no turning back." I looked down at the cold marble beneath my knees. In my mind, I saw the image of my mother-in-law standing with her arms crossed, the cynical smirk on her lips, and the phrase she had thrown at me countless times, "You have no power." I replied softly, "I am sure." The line was silent for a few seconds before he spoke. "Understood. In exactly 30 minutes, the board of directors will be fully assembled." The call ended. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. My heart was pounding, but my breathing was even. I knew the gears had begun to turn, and once in motion, no one could stop them. High above, the doors to the executive suite swung open. My mother-in-law walked out, stepping to the glass railing to look down at the lobby. Her eyes locked onto me, and the corners of her mouth curled into a smug smile. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried easily through the cavernous space. "Make her kneel for another hour. Let's see if she ever dares to give me attitude again." A few employees standing nearby bowed their heads, murmuring in agreement. No one dared to react. In their eyes, she was the ultimate authority, the female CEO who had built this empire. The woman whose mere frown made entire departments hold their breath. Little did anyone know that in the underground parking garage, sleek black SUVs had already begun to arrive. No one knew that rapid-fire phone calls were being made behind closed doors. And certainly, no one knew that the CEO title she was currently flaunting so proudly had an expiration date measured in minutes. I slowly raised my head and looked up at her. Our eyes met. This time, I didn't immediately look away. I stared right back at her just for 1 second, but it was enough to make her freeze. She furrowed her brow, as if sensing something was off, but quickly masked it with her usual arrogance and turned away. I lowered my head again, hiding the faint smile playing on my lips. 30 minutes, just 30 more minutes, and everything in this building will change hands. I didn't know how much longer I kneeled, only that the blinding pain in my knees had faded into a heavy, deadened numbness, as if my legs no longer belonged to me. But strangely, internally, I was terrifyingly calm. The calm of someone who has accepted whatever comes next, be it heaven or hell. Around 10 a.m., the lobby suddenly grew unnaturally crowded. Not the chaotic rush of morning employees, but an orderly, silent, and deeply serious gathering. Middle-aged men, in dark, expensive suits began appearing in increasing numbers. They didn't group up. They didn't speak loudly. They just walked silently toward the private VIP elevators leading to the executive boardroom. A few of them stopped to look at me kneeling on the floor. Their eyes registered brief surprise, which quickly shifted into unreadable, stern expressions. Someone quietly asked a security guard, "What happened here?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. It's an internal family matter of the CEO's, sir." The man didn't reply. He just nodded and kept walking. But in that exact moment, I clearly saw the discomfort on the security guard's face. Perhaps he, too, was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a simple case of punishing a daughter-in-law. Up on the mezzanine, the CEO's doors opened again. Eleanor walked out, but this time, her steps lacked their usual sharp decisiveness. She leaned against the glass railing, looking down at the lobby, her eyes sweeping over the unfamiliar, powerful faces, appearing one after another. She frowned. "Who are those people?" she asked her assistant, her voice stripped of its usual supreme confidence. The assistant followed her gaze, looking visibly panicked. "Ma'am, I think those are the shareholders." "Shareholders?" Eleanor's brow furrowed deeper. "There is no board meeting scheduled for today." The assistant frantically flipped through her iPad, her voice cracking. I don't see anything on the calendar, ma'am. But they all have access clearance to the executive boardroom." A heavy silence descended. I was still kneeling, my head bowed, but I heard every single word, every single footstep. I knew the avalanche was approaching the edge of the cliff. Eleanor stood frozen for a few seconds before clearing her throat, desperately trying to reclaim her authority. "It's fine. It's probably just an impromptu review." She looked down at me, her eyes still holding onto their contempt, but deep within them, a tiny sliver of anxiety had begun to spark. "Don't let her up. Make sure she kneels for the full 3 hours." With that, she turned around and marched back into her office, slamming the door shut as if trying to block out the rising tide of unease in her own chest. Down in the lobby, the way people looked at me began to change. It was no longer simple curiosity or pity. Some looked at me for a long time, as if trying to connect invisible dots. Some gave me a very subtle nod before rushing away, terrified of being seen. My heart fluttered. They know. At least, they were starting to realize that the woman kneeling here wasn't just a powerless, voiceless daughter-in-law. My phone vibrated again. Not a call this time, but a short, concise text message. "The board is assembled. Commencing in 5 minutes." I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. My knees hurt so badly, I had to clench my jaw to keep from crying out. But inside me, a freezing flame was igniting. 5 minutes, just 5 more minutes. The woman sitting in the CEO suite upstairs was about to learn exactly what it felt like to be dragged down from the throne she was so endlessly proud of. I opened my eyes. The lobby lights were still blindingly bright. The marble floor was still freezing cold, but I knew that this would be the absolute last time I ever kneeled here as a victim. From high above, the chime of the executive boardroom rang out, a short, sharp sound. But it cut through the air like a gavel determining someone's fate. Eleanor, sitting in her office, definitely heard it too. And for the first time, she began to feel true fear. The moment the boardroom chime ceased, the entire executive floor seemed to be swallowed by a bizarre, suffocating silence. Gone was the lively chatter. Gone were the hurried footsteps of assistants. The heavy, soundproof glass doors of the boardroom were shut tight, completely isolating the world inside from the brightly lit lobby below where I was still kneeling, silent and enduring in the eyes of everyone watching. Eleanor Vance sat in her usual spot, the chairman's seat, at the head of the massive mahogany table. She set her designer bag down and adjusted the collar of her blazer. Her movements were slow, projecting absolute authority. Her face betrayed no anxiety. On the contrary, the corners of her mouth curled up slightly, as if to show that this impromptu meeting was nothing more than a minor annoyance in her busy schedule. "Well, it seems we have a full house today, don't we?" She smiled, her tone light but laced with sarcasm. No one answered immediately. The middle-aged men sitting along the sides of the table merely gave subtle nods, exchanging guarded glances with one another. The atmosphere in the room was so dense, you could hear the shuffling of papers and the soft clicks of luxury pens against the table. Eleanor frowned slightly. She was used to every eye being glued to her, used to people nodding in enthusiastic agreement the second she spoke. This dead silence agitated her, but she quickly masked it with an even wider smile. All right, if we're all here, let's get straight to business. I have a company to run and a very tight schedule. A man sitting near the end of the table cleared his throat. He stood up. His voice was deep, slow, and every word felt meticulously weighed. Today, the board of directors has convened an emergency session to review the executive management structure of this corporation. The smile on Eleanor's face froze for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. The executive management structure? She let out a laugh. Is there a problem? For years, this company has operated flawlessly under my leadership. The man did not argue. He simply looked down, opened a thick file folder, and pushed it gently toward the center of the table. Before we delve into the main agenda, we would like to confirm one detail. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before continuing slowly. The woman currently kneeling in the main lobby. Is she your daughter-in-law? The entire room seemed to turn to ice. Eleanor stiffened instantly, but then she let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed in the enclosed space. It's just a family matter. It has nothing to do with this board meeting. A little discipline for a disrespectful daughter-in-law. What's there to discuss? A few board members furrowed their brows. No one laughed with her. The man looked her dead in the eye, his expression severe. In a personal capacity, it may be a family matter. But in your capacity as the CEO of a publicly traded corporation, what is happening in that lobby right now is a profoundly serious issue. Eleanor's smile began to harden. She gripped the armrests of her chair but fought to keep her tone casual. What exactly are you gentlemen trying to imply? The man didn't answer right away. He checked his watch and said, "We are missing one person. We will wait 5 more minutes." Down in the lobby, I was still kneeling, but I could feel a palpable shift in the air around me. The people walking by no longer dared to stare at me. The security guards were constantly checking their watches, looking visibly stressed. My phone vibrated softly against my leg. He has arrived. I closed my eyes. Up on the executive floor, the boardroom doors swung open. Someone walked in. Not rushed, not loud, but his mere presence caused every single member of the board to stand up in unison. Except for Eleanor. She hadn't even processed what was happening before the fate of her CEO title entered its final countdown. The heavy doors clicked shut behind the man who had just walked in. It was a very soft click, but in that moment, it echoed like a death knell. No one spoke. The room was drowning in an atmosphere so thick that Eleanor could hear her own heart pounding against her ribs. The man who entered did not sit down immediately. He stood tall at the head of the table. His calm, piercing eyes swept over everyone, finally locking onto Eleanor, just for 1 second. But that look made her squirm. It felt as if someone had just ripped off the cloak of absolute power she had worn for decades. "Apologies for my tardiness," he said. His voice was deep and commanding. "I was finalizing some last-minute legal formalities." A board member gave a slight nod. "Then we may begin." Eleanor finally stood up, plastering on a diplomatic smile. "Mr. Sterling, you are." The man didn't let her finish. He pulled out a chair opposite her and slowly opened the leather portfolio in his hands. "I am the legal representative for the proxy shares. The shares that hold the majority voting power in today's meeting." The moment the words left his mouth, Eleanor's complexion changed drastically. The smile froze permanently on her lips. She looked around the room, as if searching for validation from the other board members, but all she received were stern, evasive glances. None of the usual deference was there. "That's impossible," she muttered. "I never received any notification about this." Mr. Sterling gave a brief nod. "True, because this proxy assignment did not require your approval." He paused a beat, then enunciated every word clearly. The owner of those shares has granted me full executive decision-making authority." The room was dead silent. Another board member spoke up, his voice low. Before we proceed, we must disclose the identity of this special shareholder. Eleanor gripped her hands together so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. She fought to maintain her composure, but her eyes were already darting in panic. The man at the head of the table stood up. He looked straight at Eleanor, then turned to the rest of the board, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity. The shareholder holding the controlling vote in today's meeting carries your last name. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the room, and is also the very person. He paused, his gaze slowly shifting toward the glass walls overlooking the lobby below, who has been kneeling on the ground floor for the past 2 hours. Eleanor sprang out of her chair like she had been electrocuted. "Impossible!" she practically screamed. "She is just my daughter-in-law, a nobody with absolutely nothing to her name." Mr. Sterling replied with chilling calmness. "Ma'am, that is what you believe. But on the legal documentation, the person you just called a nobody is the person who currently holds the fate of your CEO chair in her hands." Down in the lobby, I was still on my knees, but I knew the moment had arrived. High above, Eleanor stumbled backward, her back hitting the edge of her chair. Her face turned the color of ash, her eyes trembling violently. For the first time, I wasn't in the room, yet I could picture her exact expression with absolute clarity. The feeling of her entire, familiar universe collapsing beneath her feet. The realization that the person she despised the most was the one holding the final judgment over her life. Mr. Sterling closed his portfolio. His cold voice pierced the room, and now, the board of directors will put the motion to a vote. In that exact second, the arrogant, tyrannical smile of my mother-in-law was permanently erased. Inside the boardroom, the air was so heavy you could hear people breathing. The portfolios sat neatly in front of each board member. No one spoke. All eyes were locked on Eleanor, the woman who just minutes ago sat at the pinnacle of power, entirely convinced that no one could ever touch her. "We will now vote." The chairman's voice was steady and devoid of personal emotion. One by one, the hands went up. Not fast, not rushed, but absolute and decisive. Eleanor stood paralyzed. She looked at each of them, raw panic bleeding into her eyes. There were men who used to be her right hand. Men who used to flatter her, who bowed to her, who swore unwavering loyalty. But right now, not a single one of them looked her in the eye. The votes against the motion, 0. A deadly, suffocating silence blanketed the room. The chairman lowered his hand. His voice echoed, clear and chilling. By an absolute majority, the board of directors resolves to terminate the chief executive officer, effective immediately. The sentence dropped like a sledgehammer directly onto Eleanor's head. "No, no, that's impossible," she gasped, her voice cracking. "You can't do this to me." The proxy representative looked her dead in the eye. "This resolution is effective immediately." She staggered backward, clutching the back of her chair for support. Her meticulously applied makeup couldn't hide her pallor. All the pride, all the arrogance she had carried for decades shattered completely in a matter of seconds. "There is one more matter," the chairman continued, "regarding the abuse of power and the public humiliation of an employee." Eleanor snapped her head up. "That is my family's business. It has nothing to do with this corporation." The man shook his head. "No. The person who was publicly humiliated is the majority shareholder of this corporation, and she holds the absolute right to determine the disciplinary action that follows." Down in the lobby, I heard the rapid, heavy footsteps approaching from the private VIP elevator. I didn't need to look up. I knew exactly what was happening. The atmosphere around me changed instantaneously. The security guards were no longer standing around with crossed arms, looking apathetic. Their eyes darted around in utter confusion and panic. A man in a sharp black suit practically sprinted toward me and bowed deeply. "Ma'am, the board meeting has concluded. Please, stand up, stand up." Those 2 words were spoken so softly, but to me, they carried the weight of a lifetime. I placed both my hands on the cold granite and pushed myself up. Searing, blinding pain shot through my knees, causing me to stumble. But someone immediately caught my arm, steadying me. I stood up straight. For the first time after nearly 2 hours of kneeling on the floor, I I stood entirely on my own 2 feet. The entire corporate lobby was dead silent. The people who had looked at me with pity, with contempt, with mocking amusement, all of them now bowed their heads. Not a single person dared to speak. Not a single person dared to look me in the eye. The VIP elevator doors slid open. Eleanor walked out. Gone was the aura of supreme authority. Gone was her confident, commanding stride. When she saw me standing there, standing tall, head held high, she froze in her tracks. Her eyes trembled violently, a toxic mix of fury, confusion, and utter, raw terror. I looked at her for a long time. Then, I spoke. My voice was incredibly calm and incredibly cold. 3 hours of kneeling. I have paid my dues in full. The entire lobby held its breath. I took a step forward. Just one slow, deliberate step. Now, it is your turn. Not to kneel, but to pay the price. The lobby was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. No clicking heels, no hushed whispers, just the steady hum of the central AC high above. I stood tall, facing my mother-in-law. She stood only a few feet away, but it felt as though an unbridgeable, bottomless chasm had opened between us. A man in a black suit stepped into the center of the lobby. He held a legal document in his hands. His face was stern, his voice projecting clearly across the massive space without the need for a microphone. On behalf of the board of directors, I will now read the official resolution. Eleanor whipped her head toward him, her lips pressed into a tight, pale line. A final, desperate spark of rage flared in her eyes. There is no need to make a public spectacle of this. This is an internal family dispute. The man ignored her entirely. He continued reading, his tone clinical. You are hereby stripped of all executive, managerial, and operational titles. Effective immediately. A soft, collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone covered their mouth. Someone's eyes went wide. No one could believe that the woman who had ruled this empire from the very top could be annihilated so fast. Eleanor staggered backward. You people can't do this to me. Her voice shook uncontrollably. I built this company. This time, I was the one who spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it was perfectly clear. Yes, but you no longer have the right to stand on top of it. Every eye in the lobby shifted to me. The man in the suit continued reading. Furthermore, due to gross abuse of power, resulting in severe damage to corporate integrity, the board of directors has unanimously resolved to reassign you to the custodial department. You will remain in this position pending further legal and financial review. The moment the sentence ended, the lobby felt like a graveyard. Custodial department, janitor. Those words landed heavier and more brutally than any screaming insult ever could. Eleanor's eyes bulged in horror. She stared at the man, then slowly turned her head to look at me, as if she couldn't process what her own ears had just heard. You wouldn't dare. Her voice cracked into a hysterical pitch. I am your mother-in-law. I looked her dead in the eye. No flinching, no trembling. 3 hours ago, in this exact spot, you didn't treat me like a daughter-in-law. You treated me like a dog. I took one step forward. Just one step. But it was enough to make her instinctively stumble backward in fear. So now, please learn your place. An HR representative stepped forward. Gently, silently, she placed a folded, pale gray uniform on the table, right in front of Eleanor. The uniform of the custodial staff. The action was so subtle, yet it was a devastating, point-blank slap to Eleanor's colossal ego. Eleanor's hands shook violently. She stared at the gray fabric for a very long time. Then, she let out a broken, hysterical laugh. But the laugh contained absolutely zero triumph. It was a twisted, agonizing sound of pure bitterness. Bravo, she whispered venomously. You are much more vicious than I thought. I didn't reply. Because I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the time she would have to spend living through the exact same torment she had inflicted on others. All around us, eyes were cast down to the floor. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to gossip. Because everyone understood perfectly well, absolute power can change hands in a single morning, and karma arrives much faster than anyone could ever imagine. I turned on my heel and walked across the massive lobby. This time, no one looked at me with pity. There was only profound respect and a deep, silent fear. The next morning, the corporate lobby was as brightly lit as ever. The marble floors gleamed, the elevators chimed their steady rhythm, and men and women in tailored suits crossed paths in their usual, hurried routines. But something fundamental had shifted in the ecosystem of that space. Eleanor Vance appeared at 7 a.m. She was no longer wearing her designer black power suits. No stilettos, no string of pearls around her neck. She wore a baggy, pale gray custodial uniform. She held a mop and a yellow plastic bucket. Her hair, close, usually sprayed into a flawless updo, was tied back loosely, revealing strands of gray that no one had ever noticed before. She stood frozen in the middle of the lobby for a few seconds, as if she had no idea where to even begin. A young junior employee walked past. Recognizing her, the girl froze in her tracks, her eyes widening in sheer shock. Then, she quickly lowered her head and practically sprinted away, as if fleeing a crime scene. Another executive pretended to be deeply engrossed in a phone call. Some stared at her for a long time, then turned away with their lips pressed tight. No one dared to say a word. Eleanor bent down and dipped the mop into the bucket. Her movements were clumsy, awkward. Water splashed over the rim, soaking the hem of her gray trousers. She scowled, let out a heavy, ragged sigh, and continued mopping. I stood on the second-floor mezzanine, looking down, not out of curiosity, and certainly not to gloat. I just wanted to make absolutely sure that everything had reached the exact conclusion it needed to reach. Yesterday, she had forced me to my knees on this exact spot, in front of the entire company. Today, she was bowing her back to scrub that very same floor, under those very same eyes. The only difference was that this time, no one dared to laugh. A department head stepped out of the elevator. Seeing her, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Ma'am, Mrs. Vance?" he stammered, unsure of how to even address her. Eleanor looked up. Her eyes wavered for a fraction of a second before she quickly looked back down. "I am a custodial worker," she said quietly. "Do you need me to mop somewhere specific?" The words were spoken softly, like a breeze, but hitting the lobby floor, they felt as heavy as boulders. The department head's face turned bright red. He shook his head frantically. No, I don't." He scurried away, his back rigid. Perhaps even he never expected to witness a scene like this in his lifetime. I turned away and walked back to my new office. The room wasn't massive, but it was bright and quiet. On the desk sat a brand new nameplate that had been placed there this morning. No long, pretentious titles, just my name, clean and clear. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. "Come in." The head of HR walked in. He bowed his head very respectfully. "There is something I believe you should know." "Go ahead. She is asking to see you." I stayed silent for a few seconds. In my mind, I felt absolutely no sense of victory, just a light, hollow emptiness, as if everything should have ended this way a very, very long time ago. "Let her wait," I said. "I have work to finish." The HR director nodded and asked no further questions. Down in the lobby, Eleanor continued to mop, slow, exhausting, agonizing movements. Occasionally, she stopped and rubbed her aching knees, right on the exact spot where I had knelt yesterday. Perhaps in that moment, she finally, truly understood what I had felt. No one was screaming at her. No one was actively humiliating her. But the deafening silence of the entire corporation was the most brutal punishment of all. Near noon, when the lobby had finally cleared out, I stood up and left my office. My steps were measured, not rushed, but not hesitant either. Walking down the long hallway, the sunlight slanted through the massive glass windows, casting my shadow long and straight across the cold floor. The small guest reception room was located at the very end of the hall. I pushed the door open and walked in. Eleanor was already sitting there. I didn't know how long she had been waiting. She sat with her back perfectly straight on the small sofa, her hands resting neatly on her lap. The gray custodial uniform was wrinkled from a full morning of physical labor. When she heard the door open, she looked up. Our eyes met. No more rage, no more contempt. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. I closed the door behind me. The soft click severed us entirely from the outside world. In this quiet room, it was just her and me. No titles, no power, no allies. "You're here." I spoke first. My voice was flat. She nodded, her lips pressed tight. It took her a very long time before she finally spoke. I never thought the day would come where I'd have to sit and talk to you like this." I pulled out a chair and sat opposite her, keeping a very deliberate distance. Neither did I. A heavy silence fell over the room. She looked down at her own hands. Hands that had signed countless multi-million-dollar contracts. Hands that now smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner. She clenched them slightly, as if trying to grasp onto something that had slipped through her fingers a long time ago. "The 3 hours yesterday," she whispered, her voice incredibly small. "I didn't think you would be able to endure it." I looked her dead in the eye. I couldn't endure it. I just had no other choice. She closed her eyes. A heavy, ragged sigh escaped her lips, sounding as if the weight of her entire life had just crushed her shoulders. Her voice trembled slightly. "I thought that as long as I was the strongest, the most ruthless, I would never lose." I remained silent. "I didn't lose because you are smarter than me," she continued. "I lost because I underestimated you." That sentence wasn't an apology. But for a woman like her, it was probably the greatest admission of defeat she was capable of uttering. She looked up at me, her eyes red, though no tears fell. Could you let me have my old position back? Just one word from you is all it takes." I stared at her for a long time. Then, I slowly shook my head. "I didn't take anything from you, Eleanor. I simply returned you to the exact position you chose for yourself." She let out a soft, bitter laugh, stripped of all its former cruelty. "I understand." She stood up. Her shoulders were hunched, entirely lacking the imposing aura of the CEO who used to make the entire corporation hold its breath whenever she walked into a room. Before she reached the door, she stopped. She turned around. "There is one thing. I never apologized to you." I looked at her and didn't reply. She nodded, as if she understood. "I suppose that's fair." The door closed behind her. I sat alone in the quiet room. My heart wasn't gloating, and it wasn't aching. It was just an incredibly clear realization. Some relationships do not end with forgiveness. They end when everyone is finally put back in the exact place they belong. I got home late that night. The apartment lights were on, but the atmosphere was bizarrely heavy. The moment I unlocked the door, I saw my husband, David, sitting in the living room. His back was slumped against the sofa, his hands clasped tightly together. The TV was off. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was just staring blankly at the floor, as if trying to hide from something inescapable. He looked up when he heard the door open. His eyes were red, exhausted, and laced with panic. "I know everything," he said, his voice ragged. I set my bag down and took off my shoes, not answering immediately. "Know what?" He gave a sad, pathetic laugh. "About the company, about my mother," he hesitated, being demoted. I sat down in the armchair opposite him. The physical distance between us wasn't far, but it felt like a massive, invisible wall had been erected right down the middle of the room. "Did you come here to blame me?" I asked. He shook his head frantically. No, I never thought things would turn out like this." I looked at him for a long time. This was the man who stood next to me at the altar, holding my hand and promising to protect me. But this was also the exact same man who remained completely silent yesterday while his mother forced me to my knees in the middle of a corporate lobby. "Do you know how long I kneeled yesterday?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. He bowed his head. "I know I was wrong. Since when did you know? Since I stood up, or since your mother lost her job?" My question made him freeze. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't answer. "For 2 years in this marriage," I continued, "I waited for you to speak up. Just one sentence. Just once. But you never did." He covered his face with his hands. "I was stuck in the middle. On one side is my mother, on the other is my wife. I didn't know what to do." I let out a soft laugh. Not bitter, just deeply sad. "Doing nothing is also a choice, David. And you chose it." Outside the balcony, the Chicago skyline glittered. The city lights spilled into the living room, illuminating his face. The face of a man who was realizing, for the very first time, that his silence had destroyed absolutely everything. "My mother wants to see you," he whispered. She said, "You're the only one who can help her now." I stood up. "I already saw her." He looked up, stunned. "What did you say to her?" "I didn't say anything. I just refused to save her." He stared at me, his eyes filled with agonizing conflict. "Do you hate my mother?" I thought about it for a few seconds. "I used to. But not anymore. Because I realized the person most at fault wasn't just her." He flinched. I looked him dead in the eye. For the first time, I didn't look away. "It was you, and it was the old version of me." I picked up my bag and walked toward the bedroom. "I need some time." "Me too." He stood up and called after me. Are we still husband and wife?" I stopped at the doorway. I didn't turn around. "That depends entirely on whether you finally find the courage to stand up, or if you're just going to keep standing there watching like you always do." The bedroom door clicked shut. That night, we slept under the same roof, but for the first time, we were no longer facing the same direction. That weekend, I went back to my in-laws' house. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew that if I didn't go, this would never truly end. The dinner table was fully set, far more elaborate than usual. Roast salmon, sour soup, braised pork. All the dishes my mother-in-law used to cook whenever important guests came over. But today, she wasn't standing in the kitchen. She was sitting at the head of the table. Her shoulders were hunched, her face visibly gaunt. She wasn't wearing her custodial uniform, nor was she wearing her old designer suits. Just simple, faded loungewear. I suddenly realized she had aged rapidly, just in a matter of days. The whole family sat down, but no one picked up their chopsticks. My father-in-law cleared his throat first. "What happened?" But nobody wanted this to happen. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of reproach and pleading. "You are still a daughter-in-law in this house. This is a massive scandal. Why couldn't you just think about the family?" Before I could answer, Eleanor spoke up. Her voice was raspy, entirely stripped of its former icy edge. "I don't blame her. I only blame myself for taking it too far." The dining table was dead silent. I looked at her. For the first time, I saw no power in her eyes, only the profound exhaustion of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything. But then, she paused. "However, regardless of what happened, you shouldn't have pushed me to this absolute dead end." I set my fork down. 3 hours. I was on my knees for 3 hours in the middle of the company lobby. Did anyone in this house think about me? No one answered. David sat next to me, his hands clenched tightly, but he remained silent, the same familiar silence, the silence that had pushed me to this very day. "I didn't push anyone," I said slowly. "I just refused to stand still and take it anymore." My sister-in-law suddenly burst into tears. "Claire, Mom has suffered enough. Can't you just let her go?" I looked at her, my voice very soft. If I hadn't stood up that day, the person suffering today would be me. Eleanor bowed her head. A tear fell into her untouched bowl of rice. For the first time, I didn't feel any triumphant glee. I just felt incredibly tired. My father-in-law sighed heavily. "If you still have any shred of affection left for us, please reconsider this marriage." I turned to look at David. He looked at me, his eyes frantic. "Don't blow this out of proportion, Claire. We are still married." I stood up. "Exactly because we are married, I can no longer survive your silence." I bowed my head politely to his parents. "Excuse me." Before I walked out the door, Eleanor called out to me. If I apologize to you, can we pretend none of this ever happened?" I turned around. This time, I looked at her for a very long time. Then, I shook my head. Some apologies arrive too late to keep someone from leaving, but they arrive just in time for you to learn how to live a different life. I opened the door and stepped out. Outside, it was getting dark. The wind was freezing cold, but for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt like I was finally breathing with my own lungs. This marriage had reached the point where it required a definitive answer. The next morning, I woke up very early. The apartment was dead quiet. David was asleep on the living room sofa. He hadn't come into the bedroom all night. The pale morning light filtered through the blinds, casting shadows over his face, making him look more exhausted than I had ever seen him. I watched him for a long time, then turned away without waking him. On the dining table, I left a single piece of white paper. It wasn't a handwritten letter. It wasn't a long, rambling message. It was a divorce petition. I had drafted it the night before. I wrote every single word very slowly. My hand didn't shake. I didn't hesitate. It was as if I had been waiting for this exact moment for years. When he finally woke up, I was already sitting across from him. He saw the paper on the table and froze. "Are you serious about this?" "Yes," I replied. "I'm serious." He picked up the petition and read it for a long time. His eyes turned red, his voice cracking. "Is this just because of my mother? Can't we give each other one more chance?" I looked at him. "If it was just because of your mother, it never would have gotten to this point." I took a deep breath. "I'm not leaving because I hate you. I'm leaving because I no longer believe you will stand by my side when I need you to." He slammed his hand on the table. "I already apologized. Do you think this doesn't hurt me?" I nodded. "I know, but your pain comes from loss. My pain comes from being abandoned." That sentence silenced him completely. He slumped back into the sofa, burying his face in his hands. "Then what do you want me to do? Cut ties with my mother?" I shook my head. "I never asked you to choose. I just needed you to speak up, but you never did." A long silence stretched between us. Finally, he set the petition back down. "If you sign this, there's no going back." I looked directly into his eyes. "I know." I picked up the pen and signed my name. The strokes were clean and unwavering. He stared at that signature for a long time, as if it had just slammed the final door of his life shut. A single teardrop fell onto the paper, bleeding the ink slightly, but the signature remained perfectly legible. "I always thought," he whispered, "if you could just endure it a little bit longer." I stood up. "I have endured more than enough." I grabbed my bag. I didn't pack much. I didn't need to carry my past with me. I only needed to carry myself. Before I walked out the door, he called after me. "If one day I finally learn how to stand up for you, will you regret leaving?" I turned my head and offered a very faint smile. "If you finally learn how to stand up, the person who will be the happiest is you, not me." The door clicked shut. This time, no one cried loudly. No one begged. Just a woman walking out of a marriage with her head held high, and a man left behind, finally realizing for the very first time that silence does not keep anyone from leaving. After the papers were signed, my life didn't become some loud, chaotic party like people assume. There were no celebration bashes. There was no euphoric sense of victory. There was only a very quiet morning when I woke up in my new, rented apartment. The sunlight streamed through the small window, just bright enough for me to see everything around me clearly. The room was empty, but my heart was not. I brewed myself a cup of coffee, leaned against the balcony railing, and watched the traffic below. For the first time in years, I didn't have to wake up and calculate how to please someone else. I didn't have to worry about being scolded for some microscopic error. I only had to think about how I wanted to live my day. At the company, everyone kept a respectful, cautious distance. There were no more curious stares, no more whispering behind my back. I walked through the lobby the exact place I had been forced to kneel, and I didn't slow my pace. The marble floor was still cold, the lights were still bright, but the feeling inside me had completely changed. Some things in life, you only realize how strong you actually are after you've survived them. One afternoon, I received a phone call from my former father-in-law. He spoke very softly. Her mother. She doesn't speak much these days. She finishes her shift, goes straight to her room, and doesn't complain about anything. I remained silent. Her mother asked me. He hesitated. "Are you doing well?" I replied, "Yes, I am doing fine." That was all. No blame, no venting, no dragging up the past, because there are some distances that aren't meant to be bridged. They exist so each person can learn how to stand firmly in their own lives. I also heard news about my ex-husband. He requested a transfer to a different department, stepping down from his executive track. He spoke less. He stopped making excuses for his silence. Someone told me that, after everything, he had finally started learning how to speak up, but it was far too late. One evening, while unpacking some boxes, I found my old wedding ring. I held it in my hand for a long time. No anger, no regret. I just saw it as something that had fulfilled its purpose during a chapter of my life I needed to go through in order to grow up. I placed it in a drawer. I didn't throw it away, but I wasn't carrying it with me anymore. Outside, the Chicago skyline began to light up. I grabbed my coat and stepped out onto the street. The wind was cool, the sky was high. Everything was incredibly ordinary. But to me, that ordinariness was the most precious thing in the world. I realized something very clearly. Not everyone who walks away is a loser. Some people walk away to finally live. And some people stay behind to learn the lessons they ignored for far too long. That afternoon, my mother-in-law was assigned to mop the final corridor on the 3rd floor. No one wanted that section. It was far from the elevators. Scarcely anyone walked by. It was so quiet you could only hear the wet sloop of the mop dragging across the marble floor. She bent down, her movements painfully slow. Her back ached, her knees throbbed, but she didn't complain. Not because she was strong, but because there was absolutely no one left to complain to. At the end of the corridor was a small supply closet. Today, the facility manager had told her to clear it out. The door creaked open, releasing a stale, musty odor. Inside were boxes of yellowing archives, a few broken chairs, and an old, forgotten nameplate tossed in the corner. She froze when she saw it. It was a silver nameplate. The lettering was slightly scratched. Chief Executive Officer. She bent down and picked it up. Her hands trembled, very slightly. Once upon a time, that nameplate sat perfectly centered on a massive, gleaming executive desk. Every time clients walked in, they had to glance at it with respect before daring to speak. Now, it lay abandoned in a supply closet, covered in dust, like a piece of garbage no one needed anymore. She sat down on a low stool by the door, resting the nameplate on her lap. The room was so quiet, she could clearly hear her own breathing. Heavy, exhausted. For the first time in decades, she had no board meetings on her calendar, no phones ringing off the hook, no one waiting for her to make a decision. She was left with nothing but time. She suddenly remembered that morning, the brightly lit corporate lobby. Her daughter-in-law kneeling on the freezing stone floor, eyes downcast, shoulders trembling faintly. What had she been thinking in that moment? She needs to learn her place. That thought now returned to her, word by word, like a violent, silent slap across her own face. She brought her hands up to cover her face. Her shoulders began to shake. No one saw her. No one witnessed it. No one knew that inside that cramped supply closet at the end of the hall, a woman who used to stand at the absolute zenith of power was weeping very, very quietly. She wasn't crying because she lost her CEO title. She was crying because, for the very first time, she truly understood what she had done to another human being. Outside, footsteps echoed. A junior employee walked by. Seeing her sitting in the closet, the girl stopped. "Ma'am? Do you need some help?" My mother-in-law looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot, but her voice was incredibly calm. "It's fine. I can do it myself." The young girl nodded and walked away. No flattery, no contempt, just a perfectly standard, polite level of respect, the exact thing Eleanor used to believe she didn't need and refused to give to anyone else. When she finished cleaning, she placed the nameplate back into the cardboard box and closed the lid very softly, as if she were closing the lid on an entire chapter of her life. Evening fell. The long corridor was deserted. She pushed her mop bucket back to the janitorial closet, locked the door, and stood alone in front of the glass railing, looking down at the lobby. The exact spot where her daughter-in-law had knelt just days ago was now completely empty. She suddenly understood a truth that had arrived far too late. There is a kind of power that only exists when people are terrified of you, and when that terror evaporates, everything else vanishes with it. She turned her back and walked slowly toward the locker room. Her back was a little more stooped, her footsteps a little slower, but in her eyes, for the first time, the arrogance was entirely gone, replaced only by a profoundly belated awakening. A few weeks later, I heard that my former mother-in-law had been hospitalized. It wasn't a severe illness, just sheer physical exhaustion. One morning, while mopping the hallway, she grew dizzy and collapsed. Her coworkers had to call an ambulance. When she woke up, she was lying in a stark white hospital room. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. The ceiling was much, much lower than the executive suites she was used to. The doctor told her, "You aren't in any immediate danger, but you need to rest. Your body has been under extreme stress for far too long." Stress. It was only then that she finally understood what that word truly meant. My former father-in-law called me. His voice had aged drastically. "I didn't want to bother you, but I thought you should know." I was silent for a very long time. Not out of resentment, and not out of pity, but because I knew this no longer had anything to do with me. "I understand," I replied. "Please take good care of her for me." He sighed heavily. "I am so sorry I didn't protect you that day." I closed my eyes for a second. The past is in the past. Now everyone just needs to live their own lives as best as they can. The call ended. I didn't visit the hospital. Not because I was cold-hearted, but because I understood that my presence right now wouldn't be a salvation. It would only be a reminder of a door that had been permanently sealed shut. In her hospital room, my mother-in-law lay facing the window. The afternoon sun cast a pale glow over her gaunt face. For the first time in decades, she was no longer the center of attention in any room she occupied. She asked my father-in-law, "Did she come?" He shook his head. She gave a faint nod. No sadness, no blame. Just the nod of someone who finally understood what it meant to be unable to hold onto something. "I used to think," she whispered, "that as long as I was ruthless, I would never be alone." She smiled a very thin, fragile smile. "In the end, I am the only one left." After being discharged, she didn't return to the company. She officially retired. The meager pension was enough to get by. She moved back into a smaller, older house. She cooked her own meals, cleaned her own floors, and managed the trivial, mundane tasks she used to consider beneath her. Sometimes, she would sit at the dining table for a long time, staring at two bowls, and then she would quietly put one away. One is all I need. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, I began my new life. It wasn't dazzling, it wasn't loud, it was just right. I went to work regularly. In the evenings, I read books. On the weekends, I went for walks. I occasionally met up with friends. I learned how to take care of myself, something I had constantly put on hold just to please other people. Once, I walked past the lobby of my old company, not for work, just by coincidence. The lobby was still brightly lit, the marble floor was still cold, but inside me, all the memories had settled to the bottom, like a lake after a violent storm. I stood there for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. No one knew, and no one needed to know. My ex-husband occasionally texted me. He didn't ask to get back together. He just told me he was learning how to say no, learning how to stand on the side of what is right, even if it was too late. I read the texts and wished him peace. That was enough. On a late afternoon near the end of the year, I sat by the window watching the sunset. The city lights flickered on. People were rushing home. Everyone was living their own life. Some were paying the price. Some were starting over. Some were learning their lessons far too late. I suddenly understood a very simple truth. Not everyone who endures is noble, and not everyone who leaves is selfish. Some people leave to preserve their own humanity, and some people stay behind to pay the debts they've sown. My mother-in-law finally learned her lesson through isolation. My ex-husband learned his lesson through devastating loss. As for me, I learned that no one has the right to force you to your knees unless you give them permission. This story has no grand winner. It only has people who woke up in their own ways, and I will keep walking forward. No resentment, no hatred, and absolutely no looking back. The lessons drawn from this story. Life doesn't always teach us lessons through peaceful, quiet days. Sometimes the lesson arrives silently, but cuts deep enough to permanently alter who we are. In this story, no one is entirely evil, and no one is entirely flawless. There are only people who grew so accustomed to standing at the top that they forgot how to look down. And there are people who grew so used to bowing their heads that they forgot they have every right to stand up straight. The mother-in-law in this story had to pay the ultimate price for her arrogance and her utter contempt for others. The husband had to pay the price for his cowardice and his refusal to take responsibility. And the daughter-in-law, after surviving it all, realized one profoundly important truth: endurance does not make you noble. It only signals to abusers that they have permission to keep hurting you. Some relationships cannot be saved by one-sided sacrifice. Some apologies arrive far too late to mend what was broken, but just in time for people to learn how to treat the next person with decency. And there is one very brutal, very real truth: walking away is not always giving up. Sometimes it is the only way to salvage your dignity and the core of who you are. If you have listened this far, and if you saw a reflection of yourself somewhere in this story, whether as the daughter-in-law, the wife, or simply someone who has endured far too much, we hope this story has touched your heart. Please hit the like button to support the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own story. Share this video if you believe it can offer strength to someone who desperately needs it today. And don't forget to subscribe to so that every day we can continue to listen to these gentle, profound, and deeply human everyday stories, where we tell stories not just to be heard, but to be reflected upon, to be understood, and to help you live a better life for yourself. Thank you for listening.